Chapter 2. The stranger kneed his gaunted pony and drifted across Main Street in the wake of the excited puncher. Pat rose and stepped out into the glare of the sunlight, Sam and Ezra at his heels. As he drew close, the sheriff's searching eyes ran over the messenger. His dusty, powdered form was wiry and well knit. He sat the saddle, as straight as a cavalryman, but there is where the resemblance ended. For there was nothing soldierly about his get-up. A tan silk shirt draped his slim shoulders, and a blue silk bandana was loosely knotted about his neck. Grey whipcord breeches tightly clothed his legs, while the polish shone through the thick dust of his brown riding boots. His lean features were clean-shaven except for a tiny smear of mustache that decorated his upper lip. He seemed youthful, until Pat met his eyes. Worldly wise, cold as a mountain spring, unbreakable as a rock wall. He wore no guns, although his shirt bulged suspiciously beneath his left armpit.
"The sheriff, I presume?"
The touch of superciliousness in his sharp-etched, cultivated voice irked Pat. "You guessed right the first time, mister," drawled the sheriff, coming to a halt at the stranger's stirrup. "What's on your mind?"
The other drawled back, "Oh, it's a beastly murder. I rode into a water hole early this morning and found the body of Pete Ford, the prospector. He'd been shot at a pretty close range. I immediately hastened to inform the sheriff. Civic duty, you know."
His thin lips twisted in a cynical smile.
"My name, incidentally, is Plumford. Percival Plumford."
Mused Pat. "How come you knew it was Pete?"
"Oh, everybody in Dansville knows Pete. He's been celebrating a rich strike over there for the past week. A close-lipped old mule, though. He was awfully close-lipped."
"Where'd you find him, Plumford?"
The Englishman waved vaguely towards the distant Culbras. "Out there."
"Can you locate him again?"
"I imagine so."
"Then let's ride." Pat eyed Plumford's trail-stained pony critically. "You better switch your saddle to another horse. That bay's mostly jiggered. I'll fix you up at the livery barn down the street." Plumford walked his pony behind the sheriff and his two partners as they headed for the livery.
"Pat," Sam's voice was a husky whisper, "I don't fancy the cut of that there dude. Maybe he crooked Pete."
"There he goes, running off the mouth again," rumbled Ezra. "Just plumb jealous of the dude's fancy shirt and pants. Well, you can't spend it on hooch and fluffin' nuffs, too." His one eye swiveled down at Sam's stained hickory shirt and greasy pants. "Sure, you look worse than a grub line rider."
Sam spat. "Suits me. I wouldn't be found dead in that Jasper's rig. I just don't cotton to his map, and to hell with his la-di-da."
"Maybe we should get to know the Jasper a mite before we hang him," suggested Pat mildly. "You can't judge a horse by his coat." Pat and Plumford in the lead, with Sam and Ezra jingling behind, the little cavalcade jogged out of Dutch Springs. "Any idea where this water hole's located?" inquired Pat.
"I'm not overly familiar with the country, but I'd say about 30 miles west. The place is south of the peak they call Old Smoky."
That must be Coyote Springs, kinda off the beaten track. How come you was wandering over that way?" The sheriff glanced inquiringly at his companion's features. Plumford stared straight ahead and coughed.
Well, to be frank, I was seeking for the Mirage Mine.
Is that so? Said the sheriff softly.
Kindly refrain from jumping to conclusions.
The Eastern man's voice was stiff.
The circumstances are not propitious, but I knowed nothing of the murder. Immediately I saw the body, I set out for the county seat.
You touch anything?
I never even dismounted.
Good, murmured the sheriff approvingly. He ran an appraising eye over the other's silk shirt and tailored pants. You ain't got the cut of being a prospector.
Well, it's merely a hobby,
explained Plumford.
A human failing, the lure of vast wealth. I'm not immune neither.
Reckon plenty of hombres tailed Pete out of Dansville. Plumford's haughty features creased slightly.
Not a soul. The baldy old four-flusher tricked 'em all. For several days he caroused around, and then presto, he was gone.
Their guide pulled off the wagon road at the great oak where a trail wound westward through the hills towards Dansville. The flat floor of the valley, carpeted with yellow grass and dotted with grazing cows, was left behind. The trail angled through rounding foothills that were browned by the sun. Southward, Spanish Peak stood against the sky, and far ahead, a column of yellow-black smoke discolored the crystal-clear air, marking the site of Dansville and its smelter. Beyond, the ramparts of the grim Culebras. You heading for Dansville? The sheriff broke a long silence.
I'm afraid I would miss the water hole if I attempted a shortcut,
confessed Plumford. Well, I reckon I best take the lead. No sense in riding in circles, said Pat. He pulled off the trail, heading northwest. For a while, they rode around the flanks of ridges and working upwards across the treeless branches. Gradually, the terrain changed, and the green chaparral thinned. Grass was supplanted by the occasional cactus. Nodding yucca waved snow-white laces along the dun wood greasewood, and the squat octollo dabbed the ravines with scarlet. The deep-breathing ponies slowed to a walk as they worked higher and pressing deeper into the labyrinth of hills. The westering sun slanted towards the umbrellas. Then, from a ridge, the chaos of the barrens stretched before them, like a storm-tossed sea of weathered rock washing to the ramparts of the mountain range. To the south, the metal blade of a windmill telegraphed a flash as the sun touched it. That's the W bar over there, grunted Pat. Coyote Springs ain't much more than 10 miles ahead. White dust now boiled up behind the ponies as their hooves rang against the patches of alkali. Stunted cedars and pinyons clung to the hillsides, and on a hog's back, Pat drew rein and swung to the ground to rock his saddle and breathe the sorrel. The others followed suit. Plumford walked stiffly to a boulder and carefully seated himself. Saddle sore, chuckled Pat to himself. The Englishman filled the bowl of a stubby briar with a monogrammed tobacco pouch and puffed in chilled silence. He might have sensed the hostility in Sam's dark eyes. Pat rolled a smoke and gazed over the immensity ahead, towering buttes and steep gulches, fantastic hills and twisted ravines all simmering, grey and dead, in the blue-white heat. A bitter, thirsty land, he reflected, barren and pitless. Yet, men like Pete spent their lives in their solitudes, lured by the magic of getting a gold strike. The sheriff turned towards Plumford and indicated a great granite peak
that hunched up towards the heavens, a nimbus of clouds ringing in its lofty summit. "That there's Old Smoky." Coyote Spring, located in a narrow, boulder-strewn gulch, was little more than a seepage from the base of a cliff polished smooth by centuries of storms. The wind and the water filled an irregular rock-bound basin and then spilled into a series of mud holes to be soaked up by the parched land. A thin screen of chaparral girdled the basin. Scattered about were the blackened remnants of many fires and a litter of empty cans. Waving his companions back, Pat approached the spring alone. Black, bald-headed buzzards flapped into the air and circled clumsily above his head. Across the embers of a campfire sprawled a blue-shirted body that was face down. The sheriff could not repress a shudder as he bent over the stiffened form. Plumford was right. The prospector had been shot at close range. Dried blood stained the earth around the body. It was a simple matter to reconstruct the crime. Ford had been shot in the back as he was hunkering over his fire, and the gun must have been quite close. His shirt was scorched, and the flesh around the wound was blackened by powder. A heavy caliber gun must have been used, for the wound gaped redly through the heavy smudges of burnt cloth and flesh. Pat Stevens had seen many men killed in gunfights, and was familiar with the sight of dead men, but cold-blooded murders, they were unusual in his experience, and the thought of the calm and calculated deliberation that had gone into this killing sickened him. The prospector's 6-gun was holstered. A surprise attack, and by someone the murdered man had no cause to fear, either a companion on the trail or a visitor. Searching about, Pat glimpsed a half-burnt stick clutched in the prospector's right hand. Probably grabbed it in his death agony, the sheriff reflected, and then suddenly stooped lower to examine the rock under the corpse's hand. The campfire had been built in a slight depression, and the fine sand had sifted over the rock, and by the dead man's right hand were rough indentations in the smooth sand. With growing excitement, Pat traced out an R and followed it by an I. The crude block letters grew more and more ill-shaped, as though the writer's strength was fastly leaking out. Finally, however, the sheriff deciphered 2 words. "Right is," followed by a W. An indentation showed that the slain man had attempted to read more, but life had fled before he could accomplish his purpose. "Right is," muttered the sheriff. "Right is what?" Poor old Pete had something mighty powerful in his mind. What, God only knows, though. He scratched his ear, endeavoring to read the riddle of the murdered man's last message. Maybe Wright's the guy who killed him? Reckon we can check up on that later, though. Pat put the message out of his mind and continued to search around the body. Once his fingers darted down and fastened on the dark brown butt of a cigar. Pete used Quirlies. Maybe the hairpin who beefed him dropped this, and maybe some Jasper left it who was here before him. Carefully, he put the stub of the cigar in his vest pocket. The dead man's battered Stetson, stained and shapeless, lay half off his head. The brim was scorched by the fire, and Pat picked it up, fingering the band, laid the headpiece carefully on a nearby rock. Finally, he turned out Pete's pockets. Nothing came to light save a few quartz specimens, a bone-handled jackknife, and some stinker matches, a few silver buttons, and 2 cartridges. The sheriff rose to his feet. "Come on in," he shouted. His three companions broke through the screen of brush, dismounted, and gathered curiously around the remains. "Some dirty sidewinder sure hashed Pete up," growled Sam with a side glance at the Englishman's blank features. "Find anything, Pat?" The sheriff pointed to the crude letters that were drawn in the sand. Sam squinted at them. "Right is W." He read slowly, brow furrowing. "Danged if I get it, Pat. Suppose he was trying to say who done it?" The sheriff nodded. "Maybe." He turned to Ezra. "Is it too rocky to look for sign?" "Yeah," growled the big man. "And they've been a half a dozen hombres camped at the spring this season." "Say, where's Pete's outfit?" demanded Sam suddenly. "I don't see his Jenny or his bedroll around." "Back at the Mirage Mine by now," returned Pat quietly. "Remember Pete claimed the burro would lead him home dead drunk? The skunk who downed Pete probably knew that and just naturally loaded up the critter and took off." "Ah, damn rattlesnake," growled Sam. "Well, we know his munker's right." The sheriff turned to the silent Englishman. "Are you located in Dansville?" Plumford nodded. "Acquainted with a jasper by the name of Wright?" The other caressed his smudge of a mustache and frowned in deep thought. "I'm afraid not," he confessed finally. "My circle of acquaintances is pretty well restricted. One naturally meets few characters in this rough frontier settlement of any quality." "God damn almighty," whispered Sam darkly to the burly Ezra. "If and I could boot him plumb in the seat for them fancy pants." "Are you sticking around, Dansville?" the sheriff continued on. Plumford shrugged indifferently. "Who knows? I travel as the spirit moves me, and frankly my impulse is to stick around. That Mirage Mine, it sure intrigues me." "Well, I reckon you can drift now that we've found Pete. I guess we can plant the old mosey horn. So long, mister." Pat turned away. The Englishman stood uncertainly, chewing his pipe stem, pondering the abrupt dismissal. His cool eyes flickered over the three faces. It was plain that he was not wholly satisfied. And then, abruptly, he swung on his heel and walked towards the pony, cropping in the chaparral. "Well, what's next?" demanded Sam when the clatter of hoofs of Plumford's mount died away. Pat bent and picked up the dead man's shabby Stetson, wrenched out a portion of the sweatband. Beneath it, it was sewn on a folded sheet, stained with sweat. The sheriff opened out the sheet. As he scrutinized it, he whistled softly. Sam and Ezra crowded close. "Jumping grasshoppers!" yelled the squatted man. "That's a map of the mine. How in the hell did you guess it was in Pete's hat?" "I just had a hunch," grunted the sheriff, peering at his find. "Pete tapped his head when I asked him if he might mislocate the location. He said it was in here. And when I saw the hat, I figured the band, and I also felt the wad of paper." "But you missed another bet." Ezra, fumbling around, wrenching out the sweatband with big fingers, produced another tightly folded sheet. "Let me see that conch cover," demanded Sam. "Maybe I'll find something." Ezra tore out the discolored sweatband and gravely handed the hat to his squat partner. "Doggone it, you big ape. You done ruined a good lid." "Listen," broke in the sheriff sharply. He had opened out and looked at Ezra's find.
He cleared his throat and read it out aloud. In case I check out, I leave the Mirage Mine to my niece, Ms. Phyllis Ford, Gateville, Illinois. Pete Ford.
Lucky gal, breathed Sam.
While the coyotes howled and the shadows stole across the barrens, they placed a pile of rocks over the prospector's remains. This duty performed, the three gathered around a blackened cup of coffee, set upon a small fire. Pat broke out a bag of biscuits and a small sack of sugar. The sparse meal ended, and cigarettes glowed in the darkness as the three hunkered around the reddening ashes. Stars prickled through the velvet canopy overhead, and with shrill chirps, bats whirled around noiselessly. "Ain't seen old Sock yet," rumbled Ezra. Us mosey on down to the spring for a drink around sunset." "Sight of your map sure scared him," reported Sam tartly. "You forget that big old damn bear," broke in Pat. "We got bigger things to figure on."
"I got $10 that says that dude conked Pete," retorted Sam.
"I'll take that bet," rumbled Ezra.
"Well, the payoff will come tomorrow," said Pat thoughtfully. "We'll head for the mine at sunup. Nobody knows we got the location. If Mr. Percival Plumford or this Jasper Wright is sulking around, it'll just be too bad."
End of chapter 2.